Welcome, everybody, and those who are still to join. I'm Anatol Lieven. I am Director of the Eurasia Programme at the Quincy Institute. Before I introduce today's conversation about a book on liberalism, I'd just like to advertise another book conversation on liberalism, which we will be holding next Tuesday, the 17th, at the same time. I will be interviewing Paul Robinson about his latest book on Russian liberalism, and our conversation rather gloomily will be entitled "The Tragedy of Russian Liberalism: Its, alas, failure and collapse since the end of the Cold War." So I hope if you're interested in the issues and dilemmas of liberalism in the world today, I hope you'll also come to that. Today, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce a conversation between Elizabeth Beavers and Samuel Moyn. Elizabeth is Vice President of Public Affairs here at the Quincy Institute and is an adjunct professor of counterterrorism law. And she has been widely published and interviewed in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, USA Today, and The Guardian. Samuel Moyn is Professor of Law and History at Yale University and author of, in my view at least, an extraordinarily interesting series of books about the character, the contradictions of liberal internationalism in the world today. His most recent book is entitled Liberalism Against Itself, and it deals with the question of how the nature and how the legacy of Cold War liberalism continues to shape liberalism and policy in America today, often in, shall we say, questionable ways. So I will, the conversation between Elizabeth and Sam will last for about half an hour, and then we'll throw it open to questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A, which you will see on your screens, and Elizabeth will then introduce them. So with that, Elizabeth, handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Anatol, and thank you, Sam, for being with us today. We're so excited to host you for this conversation. So your new book, Liberalism Against Itself, argues that modern liberalism is failing, and that failure stems from Cold War era thinking that needs updated. So start us off, tell us, what do you mean by liberalism in this context, and why do you think it's failing?
Well, to begin with, thanks so much to Anatol and especially to you, Elizabeth. So this book is based on some lectures I gave at the University of Oxford, and in form, it's just a series of profiles of some of the leading and lesser known Cold War liberals who I argue changed liberalism substantially in the later 1940s and early 1950s. I actually don't want to go as far as some in saying that liberalism all the way back, no matter how far you trace it, is bankrupt or failing. That claim became very famous after 2016 because one response to the shocking election of Donald Trump in the United States was that many people scurried to critics of liberalism to wonder if liberalism was on its deathbed. And one reactionary author named Patrick Deneen achieved a lot of fame for saying that liberalism has failed. I argue that, in a sense, it hasn't been tried. I actually think the same is true of liberal internationalism. And what I try to establish in the book is that there were some very promising features of liberalism before the Cold War, which was really, emerged as in the aftermath of the French Revolution to try to make good on modern promises of freedom and equality. Those kind of promising features were abandoned by my rogues gallery of Cold War liberals who said liberalism can't aim high. If it does, it will play into the hands of the Soviets, who are fooling everyone by promising freedom and equality. And instead of promising it themselves, either domestically or globally, I fault liberals for, in a sense, abandoning on what had been their goals. So they were never perfect, and they were flawed in the extreme before the Cold War. But the basic idea of the book is that we're suffering in part from some things that Cold War liberal thinkers did to their own tradition in the 1940s and 50s. So maybe we ought to think, against Patrick Deneen and others, that it's not liberalism that failed exactly. Cold War liberalism has been failing as we continue to seek enemies and focus so intently on preserving just the continuity of liberal government as tyranny supposedly lurks at the door. And if that's true, then maybe we can return to some of the earlier promising impulses in liberalism and kind of make a new liberalism that will succeed finally.
Yeah, that's one area I'd really like to drill down on further, which is a key theme you've identified at the heart of Cold War liberalism and its failures, is a reliance on fear-mongering as opposed to presenting a positive, forward-looking vision of some sort. And that strikes me as especially true in U.S. foreign policy, particularly as we continue militarized counterterrorism operations under the guise that sort of a shadowy threat is still lurking in ways we can't really define, but we must continue to fight. And at the same time, we're potentially or actually entering into a new Cold War-like era where various terrible policies continue to be justified as necessary because we must box out China or Russia from various regions. So, how do you see Cold War liberalism failing us on that foreign policy front?
It's an essential question. Just before I get to the international policy, I think it's important to, in a sense, empathize with the founders of Cold War liberalism, who before they fear-mongered experienced, let's say, legitimate fear themselves. I mean, many had seen Weimar democracy collapse, and some were Jewish emigres from various parts of Europe. Actually, most Cold War liberals were Jews by background. And then they saw the Soviet Union kind of become, we can get into the kind of gory details, an adversary having been an ally in putting National Socialism down. And so my claim is that Cold War liberals overreacted to threats, not that threats are always unreal. And when you overreact to a threat and, let's say, indulge your fear and begin to spread it and make it mandatory for others, you might experience paranoia. You might persecute. I mean, we've all seen Oppenheimer this summer, where it's precisely a story of, I think, Cold War liberals kind of not able to handle their fears of an external enemy. And I think the worst thing about indulging in fear and fear-mongering to spread it would be that you kind of miss the chance at alternative paths because you don't see them or you have an interest in confrontation, which famously Cold War liberals developed, especially over the 1960s, when they pivoted from ideas like containment of the Soviet Union to rollback and the domino theory, which led them to many unsought wars, which, as we know, set the world back. In the present, your question seems essential because our lifetimes have been defined by Cold War liberalism out of Washington. And the idea there was never making liberalism credible for the world. If anything was being spread, it was neoliberalism out of Washington. And in the face of resistance, even minor resistance, there was fear and fear-mongering. And once again, the idea was that liberalism was about the good fight as Peter Beinart put it in a book he's since renounced, facing totalitarians, whether they were, the new leaders of Russia, Muslim terrorists, enemy regimes that sheltered those terrorists, or in our day, Vladimir Putin. And we can definitely get into that. I think that this tendency has had the worst consequence of kind of externalizing all of liberalism's problem, as if this kind of endless series of threats were, something that if we could only overcome, liberalism would then be defensible. But what if liberals need to look in the mirror and make their ideology more appealing than it has been? Now, of course, lately, American liberals have found the enemy within, and have found that voters have been abandoning the Democratic Party because its liberal ideology has been less and less appealing to certain people, who then vote, in ways they find, outrageous. So, what do we have to do if we really think liberalism can change its tune, to reorient it from being about threat patrolling to being something that offers a kind of constructive, maybe emancipatory ideology, not just for Americans, but for the whole world?
Right. I think that's a really critical point. It's not I don't read you as suggesting that the threats don't exist or they aren't real, but it's about the resilience in the face of those threats and offering something beyond, at least we're not that other guy, whether it's domestic politics or it's the way we approach the world internationally. So, Joseph Stieb offered a critique of your book in War on the Rocks, in which he suggested that Cold War liberalism actually offers principles that might lend themselves toward restraint in foreign policy, such as eschewing nation building and focusing on cooperative international institutions. What is your response to that critique?
Well, it's a fair. I mean, he's a very bright guy, and I think it would require maybe getting in the weeds of looking at Reinhold Niebuhr's thought, and especially at his legacy, because as we know, he influenced not just Martin Luther King, but presidents like Jimmy Carter and most famously Barack Obama. But I will say that at the heart of the book, there's a chapter about Gertrude Himmelfarb, who before she became a neoconservative and the husband of a more famous one, Irving Kristol, and the mother of a current one, William Kristol, was a Cold War liberal who actually took approximately Niebuhr's positions, that we need to connect liberalism to a kind of Christianity that looks at how fallen we are because of original sin. This was at the heart of Niebuhr's thought, and I guess I just want to say briefly, it does make sense to me that from those premises you could end up at restraint, but all too often, I think those who have drunk at Niebuhr's well and read books like The Children of Light and The Children of Darkness have been tempted to see themselves as the children of light, and others around the world as the children of darkness. And that wasn't Niebuhr's intention. He wanted Americans to see themselves as sinful, not just their enemies. But I have trouble thinking about the Cold War and restraint in the same frame. So, if you want to claim that Reinhold Niebuhr really does give us the kind of recipe for Quincy Institute like restraint, then, well, what went wrong in the Cold War, which involved endless numbers of US interventions? And of course, after the Cold War, those interventions became more numerous, including under the watch of Niebuhrians like Barack Obama. So I don't want to rule out that there are multiple paths to restraint, but it seems like that one didn't work. And so maybe we need to think differently about the kind of sources intellectually and politically that would allow restraint policies of this superpower to prevail.
You mind if I say,
please, Anatole, yes.
Niebuhr has triggered me because I wrote a whole, or co-wrote a whole book on restraint based actually largely on Niebuhr's thought. So I can't resist the temptation to interpose. I think, as so often with these authors, it's true of Morgenthau as well, it very much depends on which book you read, because the irony of American history is, of course, could be read as an entirely anti-neocon document, precisely about how, Americans too are fallen people, and warning against the dangers, explicitly against the dangers of American messianism. And of course, Niebuhr did end up, possibly a trifle belatedly, but still as a strong opponent of the American intervention in Vietnam. I mean, one could, I suppose, see Niebuhr in this light as also a kind of version of George Kennan, who, after all, intellectually speaking, initiated the Cold War policy of containment and warned strongly against the Soviet threat, but then became horrified by the ways in which this was taken to extremes, was militarized by Nietzsche and others. So if you're going to read Niebuhr, read The Irony of American History. Sorry for interjecting.
I think that's totally right. And, read Hans Morgenthau as well, who, actually earlier than Niebuhr was critical of escalation in Vietnam when it came to it. I guess my take would be that we have unexplored resources in American thought before World War II as sources of restraint, including critiques of what came to be called the military-industrial complex, and these other critiques that emerge as cautionary notes about the Cold War seem first to have failed in their time, and to be kind of much less confrontational with the kinds of imperial overstretch, that has been, the history of America in our lifetimes.
Right. There's a particular place in your book where you note that liberals haven't figured out how to spread this idea of freedom without empire, which goes directly to that. Well, and so, I read you here as not necessarily arguing for a return to pre-Cold War liberalism such as it was, but that, as you say, there are unexplored ideas that are there for the taking, for the building, for the reimagining. Is that right? And could you speak a little bit more about your argumentation there?
No, that's exactly right. I basically think that when we look at least at some of the crucial impulses of liberalism when it emerged after the French Revolution, including the basic project of institutionalizing freedom and equality eventually on a worldwide basis, there's a very optimistic or uplifting program there that is not placing fear at the center and is not devolving into threat patrolling as a way of avoiding kind of diagnosing where the emancipatory project is. Now, there were tons of flaws with earlier liberalism, including its outright imperialism, that I don't think are worth reclaiming. But the question is, in any tradition, where do you find starting points? And it's very famous, if we think of other traditions like Christianity, that sometimes you have to go back to the future and seek in some points of original inspiration, touchstones for figuring out how to realize the promise of the tradition and creating something that's never been there. And so this is just what I think should happen to liberalism, which is in part consistent with my claim that early liberals were futuristic. Alexis de Tocqueville, my favorite really, says we should fear and we should have fear, but not place it at the center. And we need to give people kind of long range ends and long range promises that they can see liberals as committed to and fulfilling. And my worry is that in kind of making especially foreign policy liberalism about immediate threats and their extinction, liberals have given up on those very kind of basic commitments they may have once had.
Right. And just a quick reminder to our audience, I definitely have a few more questions for Sam. I'm sure Anatole does as well, but please place your questions in the Q&A function so we can make sure to get to those towards the end. So taking a slightly different course here, I see connections between the critique you made in this book and the one in your last book, Humane, in which you outlined how political energy has been focused on making war more humane instead of ending or preventing it altogether, potentially entrenching warfare itself, to very badly oversimplify your argument. Right. But if we look at the Obama presidency, which we've already mentioned here, and his approach to the war on terror, for example, he gained a tremendous amount of political capital, in part by campaigning on talking about the follies of Bush-era foreign policy, only to use that political capital once in office, not to actually close Guantanamo and end indefinite detention or withdraw from Afghanistan, but to double down on the concept of the war on terror itself with ramped up drone strikes, while in fairness, ending some of the most egregious human rights abuses like outright torture that were happening. So that's a long wind up to say this seems like the kind of liberalism and action you're talking about here in this book, an incapability of really imagining a different approach altogether or acknowledging the real source of the failures, but instead just sort of being a palatable alternative to a sort of caricature-like evil opponent. Is that fair? How do you see the connection between your last two books?
It's totally fair and a great question. Most of my books, including these two, have the same basic structure, which is to look at some set of reforms and suggest that actually they're not good enough, that they're truncated and precisely in kind of failing to embrace a more ambitious reform could perpetuate, some problems or actually even make them worse. And, a classic example for me is, what I saw happening, as you said, in under Obama, who I think did something even a little worse than you suggested, because of course there was the renunciation of torture, but that was made possible in practice by his decision to invent what journalist Spencer Ackerman has called a sustainable version of the war on terror. But note that meant stopping capture and detention, which were, of course, the circumstances in which torture and other Guantanamo-like abuses took place, in order to kill instead. And he did so over a much greater expanse of the earth. And so this is an example in which the lesser reform actually abets kind of something that's pretty terrifying. And the more direct connection to this book about liberalism and its insufficiency when it presents threats as the essential problem is that both Obama and Cold War liberals focus on, let's call it, cruelty reduction. I mean, famously, the Cold War liberal Judith Shklar wrote a book, an essay, the last year of the Cold War, called The Liberalism of Fear, saying the main task of liberalism is not to dream big, because dreaming big risks the infliction of horrors in the name of utopias. Instead, the goal has to be the reduction of cruelty, and especially physical cruelty. Well, what is a commitment to the humanization of war rather than trying to establish a more peaceful globe, if not that idea that what liberals should stand for in the world is not, dreamy notions like less warfare, but a humane form of it, which is exactly what Obama especially stood for and made all his speeches in the war on terror about.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say that, it's making me think of another piece of wonderful journalism from Spencer Ackerman, where shortly after President Biden's withdrawal of ground troops from Afghanistan, some of those same Guantanamo detainees who are still there petitioned, hey, sounds like this war is over. Is this the time when, in the absence of charge or fair trial, when we might think about release? And the Biden administration was very clear, the war is not over.
Right.
This phase of it in which they're outright ground troops, that part is ending. But the fundamental concept of a global militarized war on terror, that very much continues. And so doubling down on those very concepts and continuing those practices in ways that are incredibly horrific, as you say. You're right, I don't want to downplay at all that less torture is happening because fewer people are being detained, also because people are being killed. And so anyway, no, it's a wonderful point. So let me also mention, speaking of Humane, I would be remiss, you and I wrote a piece together in Time magazine about how this same dynamic is playing out with regard to the war in Ukraine in many ways. We were comparing a pair of congressional votes that occurred over the summer in which one measure to prevent some of the worst excesses, which was the transfer of cluster munitions, gained big bipartisan support, while another, which urged the Biden administration to produce a diplomatic strategy for how this war might end, got a few Republican votes, and that was about it. So, like we talked about in the piece, the war in Ukraine is not the war on terror. It's not the war in Iraq. It's not the war in Yemen. It's different, but it does seem like a similar political dynamic is at play, in which it is more possible and more permissible to talk about softening the brutality more, if that is a thing that can happen, more so than discussing what an end to the war itself might look like. So I would love to hear you talk a bit about what you think survives of your thesis in Humane when we look at the current context.
Well, to begin with, thanks for writing that piece with me. It was a real privilege.
Back at you.
I would say that there's a lot that survives, I hope, because it's not that old a book. But there are some really interesting emergent counterexamples to the claims I make, and it's worth looking at those too. So, it was always obvious that the humanization of war would be something that would get more ingrained more easily in counterinsurgent kinds of situations where a vast asymmetry in power, military power, could allow, let's say, softening the blow without, especially if, using armed drones, minimize a risk to American fighters in the process. I never thought that, the humanization of war, to the extent it was occurring, was, something that couldn't be reversed or would apply in exactly the same way in let's say, more conventional kinds of engagements. That said, I was shocked by one recent event in the Ukraine war, which was precisely the administration's decision in the United States to send cluster munitions, which we wrote about in a different way. But on Meet the Press, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, appeared, I think it was Meet the Press, and he was challenged by the interviewer about whether using these inhumane weapons would threaten America's moral authority, or sending them. And Sullivan responded in a fascinating way. He said, actually, our moral standing in the world does not come from necessarily how we fight, which must include compliance with international humanitarian law. Many people think bans cluster munitions. He said, our standing in the world comes from the justice of our cause. Now, that's an old idea, actually, including in America, but it is radically at odds from what Barack Obama said in his Nobel Peace Prize address, in his National Defense University address, in which he laid out kind of rules, or at least guidelines, for drone warfare, which promised that it would be humane in its conduct and compliant with international humanitarian law. so that was an amazing, counterexample to the kinds of claims, and it just shows that humane war might be a demand and expectation for some, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be a requirement all the time. There's also in the Ukraine situation a very, I think, promising development, although I think complicated too, in the return of concerns I say got lost after 1945 about aggressive war in the international system. The fear is that all the calls for holding Vladimir Putin to account for violating the most basic norm in the international system, the prohibition of aggressive war, are just about him. And I think it's, in a sense, promising that anyone could be, held to account, not for the conduct of their hostilities, but their initiation of war against the law in the first place. But it would be sad if it were only Putin and associated others around the globe for whom this lost cause, as I presented in Humane, becomes salient again. And it's very interesting that a lot of the legal debate around the proper forum in which aggressive war would be charged against, since it hasn't been since Nuremberg, are ones that do exempt the United States. And so that kind of a selectivity is very troubling. Last thing I'll say is that our concern for humane war as an audience of war, not just American war, but around the globe, remains very, I think, strong. A lot of the critique of Putin in Putin's forces in the field have been not about aggressive war, but about atrocity. And that's shown how this new expectation in how war is conducted remains, I think, at the center of people's minds. And then consider what's happening in Israel-Palestine right now. If you fear that, let's say, exclusive focus on brutality and violations of prohibitions on killing civilians are on how exclusively those occupy the center of attention and obscure bigger questions, well, we're living through a moment when, very understandably, both those who single out the death of Israelis and those who single out the death of Palestinians in Gaza, both in contravention of the laws of armed conflict, are postponing, in the end, what is the political solution that would help us think about a more peaceful outcome in the medium or long run. And so how we get these concerns, I tried to tell the history of in Humane about like lessening brutality to fit together with our concerns for peace remains, I think, a very important topic of ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. I have to just quickly say, I share some of your maybe mixed feelings, mixed thinking about some of the legal debate and political debate about holding Putin accountable for what's happening in Ukraine, so much of it returning a focus to a crime of aggression and making that a real actionable thing in international law. But it also is underpinning some observations I've written about and I've really been hung up on about the tools of international accountability, where previously they have mostly been utilized as tools to discipline the global South mostly, but becoming sort of a tool against the foes of the United States and its most powerful allies. And what is a system of justice if the most wealthy and the most powerful are not held to account in the same way? And so what does it look like if the crime of aggression becomes something really actionable, but only against Russia? and so it's yeah, there's a lot of precedent there to wrestle with. And what does that say about the future of really becoming a real system of international justice that holds the United States to account for its own crimes of aggression? Is that something that becomes more or less possible in that situation? So it's something I'm really wrestling with.
I think it's just a kind of big endemic problem in thinking about the rule of law. I mean, we know in the United States, not to get too controversial, that we have something called criminal law, but the sad fact is that the strongest usually escape its imposition, and the weak, at times by the millions, are those whom it disciplines. And the same is true on the international stage. That was how many of us interpreted the International Criminal Court in practice for a while. And I think things could change, but we wouldn't want an international criminal law that's, let's say, mainly there for, let's call it the powerful among the weak, the leaders of relatively weaker states that can be disciplined, or in many of the African cases, warlords in places without stable governance who do terrible things, but can be given a criminal sanction because they're not as powerful as the leaders of the most powerful countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, there's so much we could talk about here. Anatol, let me hand it to you. I'm sure you have at least one question for Sam as well.
Well, just one remark in response to that, as you say, Sam, chilling remark by Sullivan, because it struck me that there is another tradition that came out of the Cold War, except that unfortunately it didn't really become a tradition, which was those liberals who absolutely attacked and critiqued this attitude in the context of the Vietnam War. And there are famous passages by C. Van Woodward and others saying that this messianic approach to the US cause being just, and therefore basically anything is justified, actually makes war worse. You've written about this yourself, of course, makes it more savage. And something that has struck me so much, it struck me so much in the run-up to the Iraq War, was the extent to which this element in the Cold War tradition of people like C. Van Woodward, Hofstadter, Lewis Hartz has been ignored. I wouldn't say suppressed, but why do you think that lesson has been so widely ignored in America over the past generation?
It's a fantastic question. I should note that there were a lot of different kinds of Cold War liberals, and my book happens to be about these more depressed ones of the 1940s and 50s. But as the Cold War continued, liberals, under the influence of things like the domino theory, and also, it has to be said, relying on approaches like modernization theory, which Walt Rostow propounded before, becoming very powerful in government. These did kind of lead them to an almost kind of messianic belief in how easily and how proper it would be for America to change the world. And as we know, those dreams were, in a sense, utopian themselves, and they realized, those earlier liberals, the Cold War liberals, worse fears about what happens when you take utopia and try to apply it. The early Cold War liberals said that's what the Soviets were doing. And then, of course, as you point out, some Americans, in a sense, followed suit. And I guess I would say that what happened is that after 1989, it came to seem as if kind of both tendencies in the Cold War had been vindicated. And yet the circumstances of the 1990s were one to kind of rekindle the messianic tendency, at least some of the time. And of course, that view was especially at home in neoconservative circles, neoconservative foreign policy circles, where there was almost a kind of magical belief in the transformative capacities of military force. Sadly, liberal internationalists bought into some of those fantasies. I would say that it's really important to revive skepticism especially about kind of practical skepticism about military force as a kind of almost like an agent of global salvation. But if we just revert to the more skeptical view across the board, then I think you risk, in a sense, an opposite syndrome or set of problems, which is promising nothing and giving people around the world no belief that liberals stand for anything in history other than their own, in a sense, cautious self-defense. So, I mean, I don't want to revert to either containment or rollback, although containment was better. It brought less, horror. And so maybe we need to somehow get beyond the kind of Cold War debates altogether in that regard.
Well, I'd like to turn to some of the great questions we're getting from the audience here. And for those of you listening, it's not too late. Please do continue to drop questions using the Q&A function. I'm going to join together a couple of similar ones here. One asks, given the range of what is being grouped under liberalism, what is connecting these diverging positions to still fruitfully assemble them all under the banner of liberalism? And then someone else asked, I think for another clarifying, what is the basic idea of how we're defining liberalism?
So, this gets at a very thorny problem, and it's a debate historians like me have been having, which is, how do you think about traditions of this kind that seem to last a long time and take a lot of different forms? And I don't want to get too abstract, but I think there's a temptation to say there's a definition that it could take the form of one commitment like freedom, or a list of commitments like a laundry list of things. And I think the trouble is we've learned that there's too much diversity in what liberals have said they're for. And so what if we take an opposite approach and say we should be tracking the what people have said liberalism is about, in a sense, taking a kind of, an external approach instead of defining it ourselves, letting our characters in history define it. And then you find that they say one thing and they're opposite. And that's really the point of my book, that liberals who considered themselves and called themselves liberals changed their minds about what liberalism was in the 1940s and 50s. And it was really in the face of the Soviet threat that they redefined it. And this has a lot of effect on it may seem like a small, difference in how we study things or think about them. Or it may even seem evasive, because I'm not telling you this is what liberalism really is. But I'm going to offer two, reasons why it's still best to proceed the way I said. One is that it allows us to be sensitive to the politics of how people talk about tradition. Like, it really matters if we say John Locke, who never heard the word liberal or liberalism, was its founder. Why? Because then we think liberalism's about the centrality of rights and property. And we might think it's more about kind of getting religions to coexist. Whereas if we look at the liberals who began to call themselves liberal, and in America, there weren't many until after World War I and the founding of the New Republic magazine. The first liberals after the French Revolution said, no, we're about freedom and equality and spreading it, just radically different from what Locke stood for or was seen to stand for. And then there's that second reason, which is that taking the approach that I'm suggesting means that what liberalism is, it can't be disconnected from what we think it should become next. Because, of course, we're still in a struggle over how to define it and what kind of liberalism should prevail and what sources it should have. So I think if we, proceed the way I'm suggesting, we are a little more honest that liberalism isn't something that can just be defined once and for all time. It's what it has been made and what we make it.
Great. Another question, this person says they have a question about the importance you place on equality in liberal philosophy. You identify liberalism's core values as liberty and equality. You cite the French Revolution,
Right.
But isn't American philosophical liberalism primarily about liberty? So for some audiences, American liberalism may not be an attractive or a compelling alternative to communism, with the latter's primarily emphasis on equality. So how do you respond to that?
So that's a great question, honestly. I guess I would say that, it seems to me that my country has been endemically libertarian. I mean, it's still famous to say, as Tocqueville said, that it could disregard debates over equality, in part because it was so easy to establish rough equality in the United States, where there was enough land once, cleared of its original inhabitants for everyone to have some. And so there was no need here to overthrow feudalism and redistribute land. There was just enough for everyone. And Americans got the impression that equality is easy to establish, or more easily available than it in fact is. Of course, now liberals are aware that by embracing neoliberalism so fervently, they've given up on Franklin Roosevelt's version of liberalism, which was precisely about connecting liberty and economic equality, or at least more of it. And we live in, an America that's more unequal economically than ever. I would say that the folks I'm talking about, before there were any American liberals self-described in Europe, really did begin to think that, you can't have liberty for any individual without assuming that everyone is entitled to it. But then there's some equality that's required. And later, liberals in the 19th century, who began to call themselves new liberals, said, well, what we really have to do is establish the kind of institutional conditions for being free. It's not just a naturally occurring property of human beings, like in a state of nature and society. We need schooling, and we need, at least some kind of a welfare state. And they began to say, what liberals really should stand for is allowing people to be free by making them equal enough through things like a welfare state. And I'm for that, personally. But my main point is that liberals, before there were any American ones, really did begin to say, liberty and equality need to connect, including economic equality. And of course, that I think that lesson has most definitely been lost in the neoliberal era. And it's part of the reason I think we should go back to the future.
Right. I don't know if you have a view on this specifically, but someone asks about, with regards to Latin America, was the Alliance for Progress an example of how liberal policy from DC was ultimately betrayed by Cold War fear? Could it have been different?
I think that's a really difficult question. And I think the Latin American scene is, it's a classic one. We should think very hard about in Latin America, in the Cold War, but also after the Cold War. So, not to get into great detail, but the fear of communism drove a lot of bad acts by, our country in Latin America. It's forgotten that, Fidel Castro, once he successfully unseated the despotic, incumbent of the presidency, Fidel Castro came to New York and was celebrated as a liberal hero in the tradition of the American Revolution. And yet, things went south, as they did in so many places. There was Marxism, there were, revolutionary leftist movements, but the overreaction to them, I think, was grievously deadly. And, there's sort of no doubt about that in retrospect. I think after the Cold War, America, both on its own and through institutions it partly controls, like international financial institutions, could impose lots of neoliberal pain on Latin American economies, even once proxy wars were generally a thing of the past. And, Latin America, is a really interesting setting there, because you can see through events like the pink wave that happened subsequently, that Latin America, could be seen, from the beginning as a place that's a kind of laboratory for liberalism too. After all, they have lots of liberal revolutions in the 19th century. They have decolonization before Africa and Asia in the 20th century. And then their trouble is the regional imperialism of the United States, which makes liberalism very hard to sustain, especially when Cold War liberalism can involve so much violence, and post-Cold War liberalism can involve so much neoliberalism.
Here's a question that's big and gets more desperate as it goes on. War, conquest, and imperialism are very profitable to some, at least in the short term. How can that paradigm be changed in opposition to such forces? Is it elections? Will they be subverted one way or the other? Is there any hope?
I'm always going to find hope in spite of the horror. And I don't think it's easy to assert, but one thing you might say, and I've said it, is that since the Iraq War, I think we've seen a lot of electoral legitimation in calling for limits to American violence abroad. Now, it's self-serving, because many people are most concerned about the effects of that violence on Americans. And George W. Bush's popularity did tank, not so much or even mainly because of the torture, but because of American body bags coming home. And yet, in response, I think our politics has changed. In 2008, Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton, in part over being seen as someone who was trying to extricate himself from warmongering. Now, it didn't work out in exactly the way that, many hoped. We've discussed that. And then I think Donald Trump first prevailed against his fellow Republicans in the winter of 2016, after he shockingly condemned, shocking at the time, the Iraq War on the South Carolina debate stage, and was seen to have, ended his candidacy, but in fact became more popular among Republican voters. And then he beat Hillary, in our undemocratic system, for partly the same reason. He successfully presented himself as in favor of some limit on American force. Now, I'm not suggesting that he, consistently pursued those, but it's only fair to note that he did struggle to withdraw at least ground forces from a number of theaters and got pushback from what he called the deep state. Biden himself, when he was running, wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs, possibly Jake Sullivan wrote it, who knows, that condemns endless wars. And he was driven by these same considerations to choose a withdrawal from Afghanistan, even as he never withdrew legal authorities for endless war, and promised in the same breath to continue so-called over-the-horizon operations. So I guess, of course, the horror continues, and the military-industrial complex is powerful, but the voters seem to be making different choices and imposing different expectations on at least presidential hopefuls while they're running than was the case for a long time in the Cold War. George McGovern accepted, and in my lifetime after the Cold War. So there's a shred of hope, I think, and what really I think matters is whether those early signs of pushback to warmongering can be coaxed in a plausible direction in future years.
I agree with you on that. I've always felt like there's a lot of evidence that, to me, my diagnosis of Donald Trump is like he's good enough at politics to know it is good politics to talk about being anti-war and to talk about condemning forever wars.
Right.
He's bad enough as president to not do it and not follow through on that. But it is interesting that there's so much evidence that there's good politics to really advance a different vision of U.S. foreign policy. What we lack is the expense of the political capital once in office to pull it off. Okay, let's see. We probably are teeing up our last question here. Maybe this is a good summary one. So someone says they love that summary phase. Liberals have not figured out how to spread freedom without empire, but maybe it is just empire. Could liberalism just be window dressing, upheld only for so long as it does not interfere with empire? That might be a good one to end on.
Well, it's like the allegation that liberals are really providing, camouflage for the free market. I mean, there's so much evidence to support that view. Laissez-faire in the 19th century, neoliberalism today, that it's very hard not to grant the power of this kind of question too. And I guess I would say that the jury's out and we should give liberalism a chance to prove itself. That's just very different from what we're hearing in most kind of foreign mainstream medias, which is that liberalism is on the brink and needs to be saved from its enemies. But it seems like it needs to be saved from itself. And it's not obvious that it's not a kind of ideology that's really about empire, capital and empire, as it's, most stern critics say. I do think there are some at least possible resources that could allow liberalism to wriggle out of these syndromes. There were, even at the height of empire, liberal critics of empire, and it's only fair to note that liberals could become socialists. Many liberals helped invent socialism. John Stuart Mill, in spite of his more economically libertarian earlier years, ends his life as a Bernie bro. So there's no fate that is absolutely necessary. That's how I would see it today. And there might be something to work with to coax liberalism out of kind of its exposure to these allegations, which are explosive but seem pretty persuasive. And there's a lot of evidence in favor of them.
I think it's a great hopeful note to end it on. I want to thank you so much for doing this, Sam. It's been great to talk with you. Anatole, thank you so much for moderating us, introducing us, bringing us together. Any final last words from you, Anatole, that you want to end on?
I just wanted to thank you both. Sam, fascinating conversation. Urge people to read your book, and once again, sorry, advertisement discussion on the tragedy of Russian liberalism at this time, well, at 12 o'clock EST, next Tuesday, the 17th. So please do come. Thank you.